Has the Trudeau government banned prayer at Remembrance Day ceremonies in Canada? Well, according to a recent press release from the Conservative Party of Canada, they have. So let me share with you what the Conservative Party released on November 8th and then get to some of the details of what this means in Canada and what actually happened at Remembrance Day ceremonies across the country this past Monday. So here's the Conservative Party's news release. Canadians discovered that the NDP Liberal government, they're calling it the NDP Liberal government in order to tie Jagmeet Singh to Trudeau's sinking government, are continuing to ban military chaplains from praying during Remembrance Day ceremonies across Canada. Last year, Trudeau's Minister of National Defence, Bill Blair, promised that, quote, chaplains are not and will not be banned from prayer on Remembrance Day. But Canadians now know that NDP Liberal government lied. Instead, they gave a one-time exemption, which means that prayers will be banned on Remembrance Day ceremonies, with the Trudeau government reminding chaplains that no exemptions have been granted this year. On top of this, the Trudeau government directive removes mention of the word prayer and replaces it with spiritual reflections. The directive goes on to say that the chaplains should, quote, employ a language mindful of the gender-based analysis principles, whatever those are. If any chaplain chooses to ignore this, they have been warned that they will face disciplinary measures. So that was released by the Conservative Party of Canada and posted by Andrew Scheer, former Conservative Party leader and one of Pierre Poilievre's close lieutenants, on Facebook. Now, what does this mean? I wrote about this when it came out last year because a directive was released in October 2023 by the Chaplain General of the Canadian Armed Forces, and it did effectively ban chaplains from praying at public ceremonies. Let me read to you directly from this document. Historically, public prayer was featured in Canadian Armed Forces ceremonies and public functions as a means to commemorate these occasions, such as the Battle of the Atlantic, the Battle of Britain, Remembrance Day, and other local events, end quote. But now times have changed because people pray in different ways, and of course some people don't pray at all. So, quote, chaplains must ensure that all members feel respected and included by undertaking inclusive practices that respect the diversity of beliefs in the CAF. And you'll notice that whenever they refer to inclusive practices, they actually refer to practices that are going to exclude things. Whenever the term inclusion is used, something is about to be excluded. So, in the name of inclusion, prayer will henceforth be excluded and only vague, sort of unaddressed reflections are cautiously permitted. And indeed, the directive actually essentially orders chaplains to eliminate all public displays of religiosity, which would include crosses, turbans, collars, other religious garb or symbolisms, although presumably the cross-shaped cenotaphs right across Canada can't be torn down, although let's wait and see. And this is to allegedly protect the members of Canada's armed forces from being traumatized by public expressions of Christianity or presumably other faiths, which I've always found to be an extraordinary inadvertent insult to members of Canada's armed forces. Chaplains were actually ordered to stop asking attendees to remove their hats or head coverings while offering the reflections, because they're supposed to replace prayers, and these reflections are not supposed to be religious. So you're sort of offering up vague thoughts at what has always been a very deeply religious ceremony. In response to the backlash, Minister Blair again insisted, no, there will not be any removal of prayers. He says this directive is about expanding participation in the reflections of military chaplains, not about limiting it. But if you read the directive itself, which again this year, the CAF issued orders to chaplains saying there was no exemption this year as there was last year in response to the backlash. But they actually specifically state that chaplains need to replace the cross on their vestments being religious garments, with a generic crest. And many chaplains came out and said that Christianity is being expunged from these sacred public ceremonies by the government. Now, I think that the context here is important because what we've seen over the last 10 years is the Trudeau government working to purge all mentions of Christianity and all representations of Christianity from public ceremonies. It's, I think, very indicative that in 2015, Justin Trudeau declared that Canada had become the first post-national state with, quote, no core identity. And of course, when he claims on behalf of all of us, very presumptuously, that Canada has no core identity, what he means is that we are abandoning Canada's Christian heritage. This is because Justin Trudeau despises Canada's Christian heritage. And I make that statement advisedly. I'm not trying to hyperbolize here. Justin Trudeau has very frequently targeted Canadian Christians who are pro-life and who oppose the LGBT agenda. In other words, Christians who hold to the same principles that Christians have held for 2,000 years and Canadian Christians have held since the founding of the country. He has referred to them as un-Canadian. And so if you hold the worldview that Prime Minister Trudeau does, you believe that Canada's heritage is not a glorious past, which of course is marked with the crimes that inflict any nation filled with sinful human beings, but instead it's filled with transphobes and misogynists and anti-choice bigots and racists. And so one of the reasons Justin Trudeau has been so incapable of invoking what Abraham Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory and beckoning up Canada's past is because he wants to exorcise Canada's ghosts. Trudeau loves Canada the way an abusive husband loves his wife. He has a great affection for her. He would just like her to change her character entirely. Canada did actually have a national character and a national identity, but the Trudeaus didn't much care for it, and that has resulted in things like a directive 2 years ago in 2022. This report was called the Minister of National Defense Advisory Panel on Systemic Racism and Discrimination, which tells you it's going to be full of good stuff. The report recommended that the Canadian Armed Forces stop hiring chaplains who, quote, represent or are affiliated with organized religions whose beliefs are not synonymous with those of a diverse and inclusive workplace. There we go again. As soon as something is inclusive, we're going to start excluding stuff, and we know what they're going to exclude. Why should we be focusing on this? Because these faiths have been seen as, quote, a source of suffering and intergenerational trauma for many Canadians, with this being, quote, especially true for many lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and two-spirited members of Canadian society. In other words, the cross, religious symbolism, Christian prayers, because they're triggering to the LGBT community, these need to be expunged from our public ceremonies. And in fact, the Director of Services for the Royal Canadian Chaplaincy Service directly contradicted Defense Minister Bill Blair in a radio interview when she was asked about the so-called ban on prayer. And she said this, quote, in a public setting where there are people who do not believe in God or people who bring different perspectives, chaplains will not use that language, end quote. So the Liberals are once again, in response to that press release put out by the Conservative Party on November 8, claiming that this is sort of a hyperbolic culture war attack. The reality is, though, that it's true. And I've grown to dislike the phrase culture war, despite the fact that I wrote a book with that title, because it's now kind of used as a way of those who are denying there is any culture war attack of taking place, of just sort of dismissing this as some sort of raw political gamble or raw political exploitation of a serious issue. But the reality is that when we're accused of culture war, generally it's because we're defending a culture that's being attacked. And so the Remembrance Day ceremonies on November 11 in Canada have been one of the last public expressions of the Canada that was. One of the last public expressions of a country that was fundamentally based on Christian principles. It's one of the last ceremonies that is so inextricably tied up in Canada's heritage that it's very, very difficult to remove Christianity and the public expression thereof from those ceremonies. And I remember when I was just a kid going to the Remembrance Day ceremony in Chilliwack, British Columbia, and leaving one of those ceremonies, my mom commenting, they're never going to be able to take Christianity out of these ceremonies. She may be right, but we do see that the Trudeau government is absolutely trying to do so. And it's really ludicrous when you consider that Canada's Christian heritage used to define us to the point where it is almost impossible to pretend that Canada's heritage and core identity did not exist on November 11th. I've been to war cemeteries filled with war dead from Gallipoli to Arnhem. I've especially visited a lot of the war cemeteries in the Netherlands because all of my grandparents and all of my wife's grandparents were liberated by the Canadians in World War II. And so I've been to those cemeteries to pay my respects. The religious symbolism is infused in all of the cenotaphs, in all of the memorials. Most of the graves take the shape of a cross, and those gravestones which do not take the shape of a cross generally have a cross above each name, unless the occupant of the grave is Jewish, in which case there is a Star of David. And so to remove Christian symbolism from this is an attempt to erase Canada's past. Now, this has not been very successful thus far. I attended the Remembrance Day ceremony in the small town of Tillsonburg, Ontario, this past Monday with my family. I consider Remembrance Day to be the most important non-religious holiday of the calendar year. Obviously, Easter and Christmas and Ascension Day are more important, but this is the closest thing we have to a religious ceremony that is still a public ceremony. And I find that the older I get, the more moving I find these ceremonies to be, especially when they quote from Lawrence Binion's 1914 poem, For the Fallen. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Last year, at Remembrance Day, I got to take my children over to the veterans who were sitting near the cenotaph in the cold, kind of swaddled with blankets on their chairs, with a big rack of medals showing just above the blanket. And we found out that one of the World War II veterans there had actually fought in the Netherlands to liberate our family. And my kids got the opportunity to say thank you to him, which was a very, very special moment. But the directive from the Canadian Armed Forces was largely ignored. In Tillsonburg, they began the ceremony with a reading of the Soldier Psalm, Psalm 91. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him will I trust. Surely He shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover thee with His feathers, and under His wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in the darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. This is a very moving psalm to read in the presence of veterans who saw many of their friends perish in World War II. All of our veterans of World War I, of course, are no longer with us. I saw a few of them when I was very young, and they were very old, wrapped against the cold at Remembrance Day ceremonies in Chilliwack, where I grew up. But of course, they've been gone now for several decades. But the recitation of this psalm was followed with the singing of O God, our help in ages past, the hymn that was played by the BBC when the opening of World War II was declared, and it was also played in 1965, decades later, at Winston Churchill's funeral. And you can tell when you're at the cenotaph that the Canada that was no longer is, because you have older people, especially the elderly, who can still sing along with these hymns without following along on the back of the program that we were all handed, and they're kind of singing this hymn in their quavery voices. But most people no longer know the hymns that were the normative language of Canadian Christians during the childhood of the elderly people singing them. Many people don't sing along anymore, although I must point out, none of them seem offended. The chaplain did in fact ask people to remove their hats for the singing and the prayers, and people did so. The chaplain actually offered prayers which unapologetically commended the Lord Jesus Christ as the way of salvation and prayed for the eternal welfare of those present. Again, nobody there seemed offended by this. And some prayed along. There was a scattering of amens at the end of the prayer. And of course, the ceremony closed with God Save the King and a Christian benediction. When I posted my reflections on Remembrance Day, on Monday, I got an outpouring of comments from people who had attended cenotaphs right across the country, and each and every one of them said, with the exception of one cenotaph ceremony, and I was unfamiliar with the name of the town, that religion was very much a present part of the ceremony, that there were still prayers, that there was still the singing of hymns. And it's kind of ludicrous when you consider the fact that when the chaplains are ordered to remove religion from the ceremony, and very specifically to remove the Christian religion from ceremonies, they would have to ask that we not sing "O Canada." They would have to ask that we not sing "God Save the King." It's not just the hymns. To pretend that Christianity is not a part of these ceremonies, and to pretend that the hundreds of thousands of people who have died in Canada's wars were not fighting and dying for a civilization that they perceived as fundamentally Christian, as evidenced by the rows of crosses that fill the cemeteries in far-flung battlefields, is to deny a fundamental part of what Canada was. As one Canadian Armed Forces member who had to be anonymous for fear of reprisal told LifeSite News in an email, "This constant desire to erase God from our culture is highly ideological. Canadians do not support this. Veterans do not support this. And we all saw what happens south of the border when the government is out of touch with the traditions and the values of its own people. We're talking about such core traditional values that have kept our society cohesive and functional and flourishing for hundreds and thousands of years." He is correct, and in Tillsonburg on Monday, we remembered that as well, just as they did at cenotaphs right across the country. But I found it interesting that this CAF member used the term core traditional values there, because in 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that Canada has, quote, "no core identity." And again, when he says we have no core identity, this isn't just a nod towards diversity and a nod towards tolerance. It is a denial of the core identity that did make up Canada's past. It's a denial of the country that we were, because we were not the country that flourished and was brought into being between the two Trudeaus, Pierre Trudeau, the elder, Justin Trudeau, the younger. And when he condemns Canadian Christians as fundamentally un-Canadian, he is denying that those of us who hold to the beliefs held by the vast majority of Canadians for the vast majority of Canadian history, he is denying that we are actually participating in something that is fundamentally part of Canada's heritage and culture. Because we were, regardless of where you went in Canada, we were a Christian nation not so long ago. I recognize that we are no longer that country. I recognize that Canada is a post-Christian country. But the reality is that the only way you can claim Canada has no core identity is by ignoring that the vast majority of Canada's people, for the vast majority of her history, did not share the beliefs of Justin Trudeau and his progressive comrades, but shared the beliefs of Canadian Christians, and presumably many of you who are listening to this podcast. Justin Trudeau likes to wax eloquent about Canada. I made the mistake of reading his memoir when he got elected, because I figured I needed to be politically informed, and if this guy was going to be our prime minister, I should read his book. It was a really maudlin, soppy affair in which he rhapsodized about, the autumn leaves and canoeing and things like that. But it was really empty, because as it says on the Peace Tower of Canada's Parliament building, without a vision, the people perish. And Trudeau has no vision for Canada, and in fact, he vehemently and contemptuously opposes all of those who believe in the vision that Canada was founded on to begin with, that we were the dominion of Canada, and that this word was taken from the Bible text, "He shall have dominion from sea to shining sea." Trudeau wants to have dominion from sea to shining sea himself, and he does not recognize God's authority over himself or over the country. We did have an identity. And that identity is worth preserving, it is worth talking about, and it is worth seeking to conserve. Because if conservatism is to mean anything, it must mean preserving the traditions of a people and the heritage of a people, or if there is nothing left to conserve, to seek to rebuild that. Our leaders not so long ago did acknowledge the necessity of God's help. And I've talked before on this podcast about how over 15,000 people packed the streets in Calgary for a day of prayer to pray for those who were surging up the beaches of D-Day on June 6, 1944. They recognized that they were in need of God's help. And now, on November 11 each year, despite directives from our leaders, Canadians still gather, and just for a moment, we remember who we were. That is why I think Remembrance Day is one of the most important days. I think it's a bastion, it's a bulwark of the culture and the country that Canada once was. It's a reminder to all those who gather that we were not always what we are now, and it is a stern rebuke to all of Canada's progressive leaders, because no matter how many directives they send out, and no matter how hard they try, as it turns out, the chaplains who take the podium at cenotaphs ignore them, the people who sing along with the hymns ignore them, and those who respectfully take off their hats as prayers are said also ignore them. Because at the end of the day, nobody is offended when we remember who we were, and those who are offended aren't the kinds of people who show up at cenotaphs to begin with. Thank you all for listening to this episode of the Bridgehead Briefing. Again, if you're interested, please like the video, share it around, drop a comment to add your voice to the discussion. And if there's something you think we should cover, please also drop a comment there as well, because we'd really like to cover all aspects of what's going on in our culture, especially in Canada. You can get our content wherever you can find us on podcast apps. We're pretty much on all the major podcast apps. If you'd like to read the commentary that we put out, you can go to the Bridgehead.ca. And for those of you who are interested, we'll be doing a separate video on this later, but my latest book has just been released. The book tour starts this week across Ontario. You can find the details of that book tour at endthekilling.ca. The book is right behind me there. You can order it on thebridgehead.ca, or you can order it on amazon.ca and amazon.com. Thank you so much for listening.